Hi, everybody. So I'm going to try to do something I haven't done before, which is just fly through chapter 4, 5, 6, and 7 as the culture unit. Unit 3, it's called in the College Board way of looking at things. And I'm going to just try to go really fast and then make an Ed puzzle out of it. My hair's getting longer. I don't know about y'all's. So anyway, let's just jump right into it. Okay, here we go. So remember, this unit is about culture, and culture is, something we need to define. So I'm going to jump ahead to this idea, the idea that culture is the way of life of the members of a society. And remember, that could be mental or non-physical elements of culture, the values held by a member or group, or elements of culture that are like the norms that you're expected to practice. That's all like the non-material stuff. And then, of course, you get into the material culture, all the physical stuff, the cultural landscape, and all that. So remember, culture is not just about Culture Day when you share your food and you share your flag and all these different things, but instead it has a lot to do with that whole idea of like the non-physical, not mental values and norms of a society. So, but we do also have to look at the cultural landscape and how that impacts people that are living in the world. So I'm now going to share my whole screen so we can see a little bit bigger there. Okay. So then if something doesn't correlate with physical landscape, in other words, if something isn't environmentally determined by climate, soil, or topography, or if it's not explained by economic factors like income. Remember, sometimes things that have to do with income can determine your culture, right? Like if you don't have much income, then you're likely to have more shanty towns or squatter settlements. But if things aren't explained by the physical landscape or by the level of income, a lot of times things are explained by culture. So, in other words, obesity is in some places, but not others, right? Women's education spreads in some places and not others, regardless of income. Okay, and regardless, I should say, of in the developing world, there's some countries that value women's education and some that don't, even though they're at the same level of income. So that's a culture thing. And musical styles spread in some countries or regions and not others, and that's usually not because of income necessarily or because of physical factors, but because of something else. So culture helps explain a lot of phenomena that are not otherwise explainable, and that's helpful to geographers who are trying to find out where things are and why they are where they are. Okay, I'm gonna skip ahead. You guys remember folk versus popular culture? You know the difference. Okay, small scale transmission. Folk culture tends to, really slowly move around and really just be relocation diffusion, right? It's brought along with people, and then it tends to get squished out by popular culture these days, and has for the last, 300 or 400 years or more. Okay, so then moving on from there, you guys remember the funny stuff we did. All right, so blue jeans, women's clothing, etc. Okay, so then moving into food taboos. Remember, there are taboos of food in our culture and in every culture. Some things that you're not allowed to eat. Okay, and that's a cultural thing, and so that sometimes goes along with religion, sometimes does not. Okay, and then we see changes in food stuff as well. You see that obesity is starting to rise in West Africa, and that's partially because of these sugary things that are being imported, and then fast food restaurants. And the same thing with Brazil. Okay, so obesity rates are going up in places where that are getting more popular culture. So popular culture is associated with environmental damage in many places, and also with things like obesity and other kinds of health problems that are related to fast food and sugary stuff. Okay. Remember, we looked at how alcohol preferences in the United States are a cultural thing. In other words, we're in the bottom left of the United States on the right side map there. You got tequila, which is more associated with Mexico, and then you got Canadian whiskey up there near the Canadian border. So those kinds of things are useful to businesses that are trying to understand why things are big in some places and not in others. So if you're running a package store in Nebraska or Minnesota or Texas, you have to think differently about what's being offered there. Okay, and we looked at Zaxby's and Starbucks and how those grow in different ways. Okay, what else do you guys need to really know? I guess for this section, the idea of folk housing helps us understand how culture used to grow. Remember, people used to, bring ideas with them along trade routes, and in this case, along these roads that were built from New England out to the west and from the Middle Atlantic out to the west. And along the coast, and so people would look at each other's homes and build homes accordingly. So there are these sort of folk styles and folk regions, and that was mapped out, in early human geographer stuff in the 20th century. And then, all what came along was this kind of stuff, right? Popular culture coming along and coming up with a more homogeneous, fused together, non-regional style of housing. And so then you have everybody moving in around World War II, after World War II, and the United States, people like you and me, and a lot of other people grew up in landscapes like this that are more homogeneous. They're not particularly southern, particularly western, particularly northwestern. And so we have the United States landscape has become more homogeneous and less regional. And that's just a thing, okay? And those were Levitt towns or suburbs outside the cities, okay? And then, of course, we looked at electronic diffusion being the method of popular culture being spread a lot these days. Started with TV, and then it moves into the internet, okay? And so this is the expansion of television from 1950 to 2005. And this is the expansion of the internet from 1995 until 2011. So how many people have really gotten involved in the spread of ideas, and popular culture is related to those two objects, to television, the networks of television, and then to the internet. And of course, there's hearths associated with those, TV hearths, internet hearths, and things like that. Okay. So besides that, sustainability is an issue because folk culture tends to not survive. So as we have increased connection to popular culture, then it's hard to maintain folk culture. That could be anything from language to food traditions to religion in some cases, clothing, things like that. And so maintaining a unique landscape is actually really hard to do. The Amish have done it in the United States because they basically said, we're not getting involved with y'all's culture, and they put up a cultural wall. But besides that, you're giving in to most popular culture stuff. And that's what a lot of movies that you guys have seen have been about, that tension. Okay? So then looking at these again, there's some examples of folk housing. Just neat to look at those again and then see the difference between the folk housing in different parts of the Western world. Actually, no, that's Norway, and then this is Virginia, and this is somewhere in East Africa, and then you got the homogeneous landscape of the United States, suburb United States. Okay, all right, and we discussed how this, in later units, we saw these are the tar sands of Alberta, Canada. Unfortunately, this, which is textile manufacturing, okay, which is pop culture, and this, which is fossil fuel development, are associated with popular culture more than folk culture. So not to make popular culture the evil, entity here, but we do tend to associate pollution of the landscape, depletion of natural resources with popular culture as opposed to folk culture. Now, folk culture does have things like slash and burn, right? And which is not good. And also high gender inequality, right? Which is not related to environmental stuff, but it's related to, it's not good. And so folk culture does tend to have more gender inequality too. But overall, we look at sustainability being an issue for popular culture. That's what it tends to be about. Okay, so that was all chapter 4. We're doing pretty good. Okay, so we're going to look at chapter 5 now for a second, which is going to be languages. Okay, I don't think they're going to get too nitpicky about this. I think that if they ask you a question, it'll be about modern language use or diffusion of language, or the popular things they've asked about languages are lingua franca, right? The idea of a lingua franca like English, expanding the lingua franca use. When you don't have a common language, when you don't speak the same language as somebody, you use a lingua franca, and those lingua francas tend to be related to the history of that place, right? But these days, the global lingua franca is English. Okay, if you learn English, you can talk to half the world, right, or more. In a lingua franca. And the other thing would be extinct languages, languages that are trying to revive or fighting homogenization from outside pressures, like English or Mandarin or Hindi, that are squeezing out smaller languages which become less useful. So I think that's really going to be the focus. But I just want to show you a couple things here. Remember that Indo-European is the largest one, right? And remember that a lot of people in our class spoke a lot of these languages, right? And then also remember that if you look at a map like this, you should generally know what language families are where. Indo-European is that white area, from Russian all the way through Europe and through northern United States or America, North America and South America as well. So just remember that. And then, of course, this big Afro-Asiatic, which would be Arabic, across here is another big one to know about. And then, of course, Sino-Tibetan over here in Asia. And I think just remember that Japanese, Chinese, and Korean are all part of East Asia, but they are all three different language families. And that makes them very different ethnically, very different culturally, because if you can't speak a similar language with each other, it's very different. Like Spain versus Italy, their languages are very similar. France, Spain, and the Romance languages are very similar. But Mandarin and Korean and Japanese are not. And that has to do a lot with why East Asia is not really a homogeneous region at all. Okay, that's one big thing. I think also knowing, I mean, they're not going to ask multiple choice questions. So I don't think they're going to go into this whole idea of the nomadic warrior hypothesis and all that. I think that you just need to know that there are different theories about where Indo-European language came from, or where languages come from in general. And they tend to diffuse with relocation and contagious diffusion, etc. Okay, dialects, just remember what those are. Okay, and remember that we still have dialects in the United States. They tend to be just little words here and there and phrases and accents, but they're still there. And we saw that with pop versus Coke versus soda, and many other words that we messed around with. Okay, you're not going to ask questions about very specific language conflicts. I don't think they'll give you a choice. So review the language conflicts you know about in the world, but you're going to get to pick the ones you get to write about if they give you that. They'll give you some stimulus to look at, some pictures to look at, so you'll get to use those. Remember this, assimilation. Remember, taking away the native languages involved the forced assimilation of people taken off of Indian reservations, Native American reservations, educated in English, taught Christianity, and then brought back to their parents. This is a perfect study in why culture is so strong and how people that are trying to eradicate culture have to go to extreme measures to get rid of those cultural beliefs. And this was about as extreme as you can imagine. So we discussed that in class. But just remember that culture is something that is really, really, really strong and can cause conflict when you have two different civilizations or cultures that believe very differently about things like private land ownership or about gender rights and things like that. Okay? Gosh, you guys did great work on this. I remember that. Okay. Yeah, I think we're going to get into pidgins and all that stuff, pidgin languages and Creole. Just remember, a Creole language is a combination of languages, and it evolves into a language sometimes. Okay? Let's move on to chapter 6. You're doing great if you're still here. Okay, so here we go. Religions. Ooh, so much, right? If you remember, there's a video that I guess I could post in there. I'll post it in Google Classroom as well. That was a review video about their religions. It's 10 minutes long. It's from the BBC, I think. It's awesome. I'm going to show it to my kids next week when I have a little bit of time to help homeschool them. It's about Buddhism and Hinduism and Judaism and 5 big religions in the world. But with religion, I think the main thing to know about is the difference between universalizing and ethnic religions. Most of the big religions of the world are universalizing religions. Do you remember 2 ethnic religions, you guys? 2 famous ones? Okay. One is in India. It's called Hinduism. That's right. And then the one is mostly in the United States and Israel. Judaism. That's right. Judaism, though, is very small in terms of the number of adherents to it these days, right? Partially it's small because of all the persecution in the past, but a big reason it's small is because it's an ethnic religion. It doesn't attempt to expand. It doesn't attempt to reach out and get other people to join it. Whereas the big universalizing religions are Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, okay? Now, Hinduism, right, is an ethnic religion, and Hinduism is massive, but not because they're going out and converting people, but because Hinduism is in India, and India has massively increased because they went into stage 2, and then stage 3, and they're just huge amount of people, over 1 billion, right? So that religion is still an ethnic religion, which is interesting. Whereas Christianity and Islam are actively expanding, right? And are going to continue to expand in the next century. Okay, so that's the big thing, I think. Going back and learning all about the religions, you should be familiar with them, because if they ask you a religion question and you don't know about it, we're in trouble, right? But there's that. Okay, remember this too. This was like looking at different religious groups. How did they get there? And if you look up here, this is this top religious group, which would be a denomination. That was the one started by Martin Luther, came from Germany and Scandinavia. That's right, it's Lutheranism. And this one was started by Joseph Smith over here in New York. He got kicked out of there, got kicked out of here, ended up here. That's right, Church of Latter-day Saints, or Mormonism. And then down here is the belt that you guys are in, the Bible Belt. And that means that the Bible Belt is defined as a place where most people that are Christian that are Baptist. So Baptist church is the largest. Okay? So that doesn't mean everybody's Baptist, but there's a whole lot more Baptists there than anything else. And so that was showing that. That was from an FRQ. The FRQ is asking, how did these religions get there? And of course, Lutheranism came with Germans and Scandinavians. Mormonism got where it was because of persecution. And Baptists came here as you started seeing people coming at a particular time in American history when people were coming from England and other parts of Western Europe and settling in the South. Okay. So then remember, Islam has two branches, Sunni and Shia. Those are not ethnic identities, but they kind of are in a way. You got your ethnic identity as ethnicity is with religion. Sorry, is often defined as your language and your religion, your clothing and your food and all that. Sunni and Shia are a sort of identity, even though the main beliefs are very similar. Islam is Islam, but Sunni and Shia do have theological differences a little bit. They have differences politically for sure, but they're just one of the layers of identity in the Islamic world and in the Middle East. And not just the Middle East. Remember, it's important to know that Indonesia is very, very Muslim, and it's the largest Muslim country in the world. It's not in the largest Muslim country in the world is in Southeast Asia, and that's worth knowing because it's not a continuous region, right? Okay, remember this too. Shia Islam. I can imagine a question where they're asking you about some things in the Middle East because there's so much to talk about with culture. But I think knowing that Iran is the hearth of Shia Islam, and Iraq is sort of a crossroads, you could say, of Shia and Sunni, and that Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Syria, these are mostly Sunni areas, right? But there's a mix. The main thing is to know that Sunni and Shia live amongst each other, but there's big clusters of Sunni in some places versus other. And that does play into geopolitics. It plays into war. It plays into where people want the borders to be. And it's a layer of identity. Okay. Buddhism, not gonna have to know the branches. I'll just say it straight up. Okay. If there's a question about branches, I quit. All right. Buddhism is a universalizing religion. It appeals to all kinds of people. They adapt it in their own way. And you got it all the way over, and you got it in China. You actually do have it in Japan, even though they don't show it on here. It's Zen Buddhism over here. But Buddha has the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and those are able to be adapted to many different cultures, like Christianity and like Islam, have their simple, teachings that are easy to enfold into the religion the culture that they're within. Okay. Besides that, this is a big story. Okay, the idea that over time, look how many people were studying traditional religions in 1900 in Africa. Okay, and again, we got to be skeptical about maps. How'd they get this information? Blah blah blah. But I think the point here is that most people in sub-Saharan Africa were practicing traditional animist religions or regional local religions, and then over the last 100 years and more than that, you see the erosion of that. Why is that? One, rural to urban migration, right? You lose your religion when you go into the city if you had a traditional religion that relied on local deities and local sculptures and local dances and local masks and places in the landscape that were associated with your gods and goddesses. So those religions tend to be dropped, and people adopt more universalizing religions like Islam and Christianity or something else. And so you see that rural to urban migration, contact with universalizing religions, sometimes missionary activity, but that's not the biggest one. But you do have also the relocation diffusion of Islam and Christianity from Europe and the Middle East to here that's also eroded African religion. Okay? And of course, that's a point of tension for places like Nigeria and Congo, where you have different religions and different ethnicities as well. It's another layer that makes it hard for people to assimilate and get along with each other sometimes. You know, it was also a big thing in Sudan. Remember, we talked a little bit about that here, about southern Sudan, which is now South Sudan, having differences not just in ethnicity but in religion as well. They tend to be more traditional Christian and animist down here. Okay. I think that's it for now. The cultural landscape stuff, just remember the cultural landscape. Buddhism is different in Cambodia than it is in Japan, than it is in China. And the landscapes sometimes share a similarity. You have a praying Buddha there, a praying Buddha there, and a praying Buddha there, right? But actually, this is Hindu, but whatever. There's Buddhists in Cambodia as well, and in some of the sculpture here. Okay. Hearths. Remember, this right here is Islam. This right here is Christianity. This right here is Hinduism. Buddhism. And all these spread out through relocation diffusion. You could say stimulus diffusion as people adopted it and changed it a little bit. Hierarchical diffusion if there was an empire involved. So just review that and think about that. It's an easy question for them to ask. I'd love it if they discussed the growth of Christianity, right? That you have relocation diffusion at first through Paul and Jesus, of course, started it, but then Paul has his missionaries, and they all kind of head out, and then you got Rome in 300, so 300 years later, after persecuting all of the Christians, becomes Christian, and then they spread it throughout their empire, and then they collapse, but Christianity stays. So basically, that whole process of relocation diffusion and then hierarchical diffusion would make it so that then, after that happens, when Columbus sails the ocean blue and heads out to North America, then Christianity had magically made it to England and Spain and everywhere else and makes it over to the Americas. And that's a story about diffusion. Okay? All right. And then this story of the spread of Islam. Yes, there was conquest at first, and some people, Islam spread through conquest at first, and through interaction, just like the spread of Christianity spread through conquest largely. But then it also spreads through missionaries to Southeast Asia, and then it just spreads through contagious diffusion once the sort of empire is set up and everybody's following the five pillars, etc. Okay. I think that's all we're going to do right now. Yeah, other cultural landscape stuff you might want to review and just look at. Just scroll through this. Okay. All right. So you got hierarchical versus autonomous religions too. Some religions are very hierarchical, like the Catholic Church, and some are very autonomous, like you could say Lutheran Church. You don't have a head of the Lutheran Church. So sometimes that organizational structure can make religions interact differently. And again, religion can be an aspect of conflict, even in identity, even in places like Ireland and the UK, where you have a cluster up here of Protestants in this island called Ireland. And when they achieved independence, they didn't fully achieve independence because a lot of people in Northern Ireland were Protestant, and there's a lot of connection to the UK. So it was ethnic, yes, it was political, but it was also religious. Okay, and you can see the clustering of religion in Belfast in Northern Ireland here. Okay, and we're not going to go back into the whole story of Israel since 1947, but do recall that was not fully religious. It was really, in many ways, it's a political thing that began in 1947. It doesn't go back. The exact conflict that we talk about now does not go back to ancient times. It's a more recent political struggle between Israelis and Palestinians in this area, but religion is a layer of the differences there, and it's also certainly a big layer of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, figuring out how to deal with Jerusalem is a very religious issue that's very hard to untangle because Judaism, Islam, Christianity all consider Jerusalem very important and holy. Okay, as you can see in this very small area of Jerusalem here, okay, the old quarter or the old city. Okay, so one more chapter. We're almost there. Hopefully this won't cut off. So that's 6. Okay, here we go. Last one, ethnicity. I'm going to show that one. Okay, so ethnicity. Remember, ethnicity is not religion. It is culture, though. Okay, it's identity with a group of people who share cultural traditions. It's not race. Okay, it's not the identity with a group of people who share biological ancestors necessarily. So in the United States, we have different ethnicities and we have different races. But just remember that race is more about skin color, about physical features, and that's what that word tends to mean. Whereas ethnicity is more about, hey, what's your cultural tradition? So if somebody said, "What's your ethnicity, Mr. McMaken? Are you Irish American?" I'd actually say no. I'm just Merkin, right? I'm from Georgia. I'm Southern, right? I like a lot of different cultures. I like Irish music, but I picked it up later. So I'm not going to call myself Irish American, right? I'm going to say my ethnicity is not that, right? So ethnicity tends to be if you really do have a strong sense of your food traditions, your religious traditions, your clothing traditions are all part of that particular culture. That would be called an ethnicity. Okay. All right. So moving on from there. So the census is very important. Okay, understanding the census, in that the census is something that sort of tracks where people are, where different ethnicities are, is part of the neat thing about the census. Our census does a great job of sort of like letting us see how things change every 10 years, right? But the census is not perfect, and the questions that they ask are not very descriptive sometimes. I don't know if your family has done that census this year or not, but I like the way they're doing it now. It's better than it was 10 years ago. But it helps, it helps us map things. But when you ask a certain question in the census, it makes it hard to map it in the way that you would like to map it. So I won't get into all that, but I'll just say that mapping over time, if you change the questions, it's hard to map it because the questions have changed, the categories have changed from year to year, but whatever, okay? So remember, there are some very clear clustering of ethnicities and like we saw with religion, related to ethnicity. Hispanics tend to be here. Remember why Hispanics are in these places. Okay, we discussed it first week, but now you understand that better. You understand why, even though lots of African Americans live in lots of urban areas around the country, on a county choropleth level, this is where African Americans are clustered. Okay, 25% and above in these areas, and that has to do with history, right? And Asian American doesn't look very large in this map, but that's because Asian Americans are very evenly distributed throughout parts of the country and also in urban areas, so it doesn't show up very well on that map. Okay, a couple more things. Okay, remember that the story of how people get from place to place in the United States has to do with voluntary migration in some cases, with forced migration in some cases. Okay, and that Asian Americans, for instance, have been much more recent migrants, except for a lot of Chinese migration to California back in the 1800s, and then Filipino migration at the beginning of the century and all the way up until now. These other groups have all been very recent migrants since like 1970, 1980. And so Asian Americans have changed significantly in terms of as a category. That most Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese people that are in the United States today, and for that matter, Indonesian and whatever, have come in the last generation or two, whereas Chinese and Filipino migrants might have been a little bit earlier. But most Chinese migrants are from recent times, okay, even though there have been some from way back. Remember, there's the Chinese Exclusion Act, which totally shut down Chinese migration for many, 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 many years, okay? Within the United States, remember the Great Migration, right? Remember that African Americans left the South in large numbers, first right after around World War I, and then again after World War II. So the Great Migration we often call around World War I, when there's a desire for cheap labor, and the South was a very poor place. So not just poor whites, but poor African Americans were moving to the north, and then moved even more so to the west after World War II or during World War II. So a lot of African Americans were on the move once it was possible to do that, and once there was a pull factor up north. A lot of people make the mistake that right after slavery was over, all African Americans left the South for going to cities. Not true at all, because most people can't afford to just move. and they have to go to a place where there's a pull factor, there's work. There was not work for African Americans in large numbers up here because of a massive immigration from Southern Europe, from Eastern Europe, that would make it hard for African Americans to get hired in the North. So they wouldn't go for quite a while after that. Okay, but then you start to see the evidence of that, right? The first Great Migration. Look at how many African Americans have moved into these cities in the North here. Increase of 10% or more over that period, and then here, much bigger increase at 1940, 1970 in Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, even Denver. A lot more, evenly distributed African American population in cities instead of just being clustered in the rural South, which is neat because once that starts to happen, this is where African American pop culture takes off and really, in a way, defines American culture. Is African American culture once it is able to be a part of popular culture in a way that it deserves, or it can be. Once you got the Harlem Renaissance and everything after that, and jazz music and blah blah blah, then it takes off and it becomes some of the most vibrant culture in the world. And still to this day, rock and roll, hip hop, reggae for that matter, are all musics that are the most popular in the world, right? And so remember, segregation continued though in northern cities and did not just go away. In fact, it got worse in the North in some ways because of the way that redlining worked and all that kind of stuff. Okay. All right. So then moving on from there, remember that we looked at this particular thing, right, about lynching and forced migration in the South, that this is a representation by a human geographer of the number of lynchings between 1877 and 1950. And looking at it this way is very important to understand the massive push factors out of the South, making people want to leave. It shows you that if people weren't leaving in massive numbers from the South when you had this kind of lynching going on, then there were not enough pull factors until later, until industrial work is available up north. So just this helps document a push factor, and a tragic one that is near to home. Remember, this is where our school is. This is where the last mass lynching in the United States was, right behind Washington Farms. Okay, and then over time, the distribution of ethnicities changes. Remember, as we discussed in our cities unit or urban unit, apartheid is a South African policy, and many argue nowadays that there is a policy of segregation in the United States that's not just by choice, it is by law. In other words, laws have made it possible for African American and settlements to be the way that they are. In the modern landscape, so segregation, in other words, does go back to something like slavery, but it goes much more into the whole concept of redlining and all that kind of stuff. In these new cities where African Americans are moving to, there's discrimination, that's housing discrimination and job discrimination that really clusters people into certain places. And then once you have white flight and you have racial covenants, then it becomes really hard to break that cycle. And so in the landscape today, we see apartheid in the United States, just like we see apartheid in other parts or in places like South Africa. Okay? So then besides that, ethnicity is everywhere, right? There's so much ethnic diversity in some places like Sri Lanka, like Lebanon, like India, right? And a lot of that is not tension, right? A lot of that works just fine. But it's ethnic diversity that is in places like India, the United States, multi-ethnic nations. Some nations have one ethnicity, right? Or with a very small minority of not that ethnicity, and they have certain centrifugal forces because of that. And then certain centrifugal forces can occur as well. But that's going to be coming into what's going on in the next unit. Okay, remember Kurdistan. Remember the Kurds. They are an ethnicity without a state. So that's going to come up in the next unit as well. Okay. So besides that, I think that thinking about how this stuff, ethnicity and religion, all starts to become a part of what, is it acting as a centrifugal force, as a centripetal force? How does it all work out, right? And when we get into our political unit, next unit, then, where these borders are they drawn in a way that takes ethnicity into account and religion into account or not? Because the way they're drawn can cause international conflicts or interregional conflicts or not. Okay, so we just did it all. Culture, good job, proud of you. Hopefully you learned something from this, and I hope to talk to you guys soon. Okay.